Hello there. You are tuned in to KPCALP, Petaluma, California, 103.3 FM, and you are here with DG the 30-something in my show called State of the Union. I want to start by saying thank you to everyone that showed up at our Lagunitas fundraiser on May 20th. We had a great turnout, which is amazing. We filled that place up. If you could not make it, there are still many ways to donate, and we rely on donations to keep this amazing Petaluma resource available. So you can donate. We have a brand new website, so if you haven't seen it, check it out, petalumaCommunityAccess.org, and you can find ways to donate there. Also, become a member. We are a 100% volunteer member organization. We of course have staff, but all of our members are volunteers. The annual fees are very reasonable, and you get access to the radio if you want to do radio, if you want to do video production, and we have computers, and we have programs, and we have, some people want to do video, but they don't have the video editing program, so we have all that here. And so please come in. You can check out equipment and do all that cool stuff. So, like I said, please come by. We, as I always say, I think I've said this every show for the last few months, but since I spoke about it probably a year ago. But I do really feel, and I actually went to a community radio conference in Boston, which just our keynote speaker, I can't remember his name off the top, but he had worked with many media outlets, so we were in agreement, and I got affirmation that community media does actually uphold democracy in our country, because we're offering a voice to anyone that works and lives in Petaluma to express their opinions, to whether it's through music, whether it's through talk, whatever that looks like, which is a really important, like I said, it's a really important element to maintaining our democracy. I really, really believe that, me being able to have a show here and talk about policy and talk about issues is, hopefully what people need to hear. So I am here to talk about poverty in the U.S. today. Not the happiest topic, but I think it is an incredibly important one. Living in California especially, I feel kind of like the conversation has only more recently started about poverty in the United States, because California, I live in the North Bay. So living in the Bay Area, you have the tech boom in the South Bay, and the East Bay is really growing very rapidly. We have a lot of universities around that are, we have Stanford, we have Berkeley, so we have a relatively high educational attainment, which means that people have a high school diploma. That's how the census measures that. So relatively, we are kind of living in an isolated world in California, and I think that this conversation about poverty in California has become more prevalent. But the reason I want to do this show, because I don't think that poverty in a national context is talked about here. I mean, in general, it's not talked about, but I think in California, and I've said it before, especially in my shows, that especially around the election and stuff, that in California, we live in a very specific bubble, and so we need to start seeing outside that bubble in order to understand what people, especially in the Bay Area, I mean, you can go to the Central Valley, you can go to places in California where you're going to see poverty, but, I mean, how many of us stop in Salinas or Bakersfield? We don't go to those places. We drive right by. We don't think about it. So I think it's I have a lot of information, so I want to get started, but I hope, I think that the conversation about poverty at a national level needs to be taken a little bit more seriously, because we're dealing with severe income inequality and all these causes of it. So we are going to talk about it right now. So let me start. So I'm going to start with some background. So the poverty measure was actually just created in the 1960s. I don't know, just, I mean, that's many years ago, but for me, I'm just, well, it's like relatively recently. It was created by an economist. Her name was Molly Orshansky. I'm probably butchering that, but so she created this measure of poverty, but it was actually it was measured differently back then. It was measured, she took ag communities and kind of looked at the different income levels, and that was kind of, it was ag based data that she was looking at, and then of course it's expanded to a national calculation. And I will give a plug really quick because during one of the shutdowns, I think like 4 or 5 years ago, they got rid of the census.gov application, which I'm one of those nerds that was very depressed they got rid of the mobile application. But if you go to census.gov, they have something called the American Fact Finder, and you can get super cool data. Not super cool, I mean, you know, like I said, looking at the poverty data is not cool, but you can get a lot of data. You type in the city, the county, or you can type in the state, and you can see so much data. You can see demographics, economics, education, all this kind of stuff. So if you're ever looking for a resource for that, it's really cool. And they have some really advanced services where you can actually look based on census tract and all this kind of stuff. But at a global level, I think it's very easy to use just to, you know, if you're, I don't know, if you're interested, I'm interested, maybe someone will be interested out there. So anyway, so it was created by this economist. And so now we're going to get into the actual poverty statistics. So just so you know, I always like to start with statistics and to give perspective on how global the issue is. So because I think that, I know I was reading this whole thing about housing stigma, and they said don't lead with numbers, but that's something that I like to do on my show because I think that those who are interested are going to be relatively, I don't want to say shocked, but relatively, you know, surprised by what the numbers look like. So in 2011, which is the last time we had a formal census, so the American Fact Finder does estimates based on smaller data sets. So we have a census coming up. I encourage everyone, please fill out that little thing you do it online or that little card, because this is such important and valuable information to how policy is constructed. And, you know, it is so, I cannot stress it enough. It's so essential. It's anonymous. You don't have to worry about, you know, one thing or the other, but please fill out that census information because it might seem cumbersome. And, you know, it's not really that much, but please fill that out because, like I said, professionals in the field like myself or individuals use this data, and it's essential to share the data. So in 2011, 46.2 million people, or 15% of the total population, were in poverty. So, and, you know, the data sets kind of showed that, this is census data. So the analysis in the article I looked at was from debt.org, but I talked about how it actually hasn't changed that much. So that was kind of a tiny positive that was mentioned, but, you know, so anyway. But there's this idea of nearly in poverty, which is, so I should say that the federal poverty level is based on these averages. Again, why it's important to do your census data. So it's based on these national averages of income. And so there's levels. There's like individual poverty, family of X, Y, and Z, number of kids. It's very low. I think the last time I looked, I want to say it was like 13,500 was considered a someone in poverty that is an individual, which is, God, that's insane to think, but that's their annual income. That's like in California, I mean, that's insane to think about, but there are people living in poverty. So that's where these numbers come from. So the estimate, that is, if you include those who are nearly in poverty, it brings it up to 100 million people in the United States. So 16.4 million are children, so under the age of 18. which is 22% of the population. So over 65. So I think that when I was reading this data, I think we have this kind of idea that, and I'm not saying that elder care is, supporting is not important. That is absolutely important as well. But it's 8.7% of the impoverished population. And so, I think that, and I'll get into this later, but I think we're forgetting our children, that are living in poverty. And of course, it means their families living in poverty, but, I think that this is a really important thing to look at. And like I said, I'll get into that more. So in Sonoma County, as well as California, we have relatively low rates of poverty. So in Sonoma County, it's 10.7%, and the state of California, it's 15.1%. Again, not saying that's not important, but I think this is why it's often overlooked in poverty levels. So the populations that are among the most impoverished, and again, this is from debt.org, so there are certain populations that obviously suffer from higher levels of poverty than others. So some of those are female-based homes with no father present. That's 31.2%. And young adults without a high school diploma is 31% overall, but 43% for African Americans, which we'll get into income inequality later. So those living with an unemployed head of household is 32.9%. And then minorities, it is 27.6% for African Americans. I'm not sure why they didn't give the other data, but they pulled that one out because I think it's the highest. It's not the highest because I'm pretty sure, and this is data that's not extrapolated enough or disaggregated enough, but Native Americans, I know, suffer the most from poverty nationally. So again, that data is just never pulled out because it's a relatively small population. And in California, what has happened is that the tribes were separated during the terrible times where all the tribes were separated and decimated. So what would have been maybe a couple tribes, I'm speculating, but what would have been one tribe or two tribes or three tribes is now a bunch of small tribes. And so they experienced a lot of poverty. And because that's not recognized at a federal level, there's not an understanding of what a bunch of tiny tribes, like what they're having to go through, and what their reservations are going through, and how hard it is to get funding to support that because they are small populations. So there's a lack of understanding of how that all looks, especially in California. So I don't want to forget that population because, again, I think they're definitely affected in California in a different way. And there's poor tribes all over the country. But California is a very interesting situation. So we went over that. So, the interesting, I was just having this conversation yesterday, and so when I started looking at the data, it confirmed what I was saying, which, I don't like to say things that I don't think are untrue, or I'll say, correct me if I'm wrong, I think I'm in the ballpark, but I might be wrong, so correct me. But urban poverty is prevalent, and I think what we see, and again, I hate to backstep, and my friends keep telling me stop doing that, we get it, but again, it's not that that's not important, but I also think that there's kind of this stereotype that urban poverty is the biggest issue, which again, it is an issue, but that's actually not where we see the relatively highest poverty levels. We actually see the highest poverty levels in the South and the southwest regions of the United States. So urban poverty is closely correlated to a lack of industry, or where industries have left that area, and we have plenty of examples of where that looks, Detroit, Flint, all these, St. Louis, I think parts of St. Louis. So we see that where industry has left that urban area. And so a lot of those people have been, they can't find jobs. They can't, if you're a factory worker or were in the coal mines and those things are now obsolete or they've been outsourced to other countries or all that kind of stuff, then you're kind of now between a rock and a hard place because, it's hard to mitigate living in a city when that happens. So 7 of the 10 states with the highest rates of poverty are in the South. So Mississippi is 20.8% of the impoverished. Louisiana is 20%. Kentucky is 18.5%. West Virginia is 17.9%. Arkansas is 17.2%. Alabama is 17.19%. And Georgia is 16%. And the other 3 states that have very high levels of poverty is New Mexico is 19%, Arizona is 16%, and Oklahoma is 16.3%. And what's interesting to me about New Mexico, Arizona, and Oklahoma, again, going back to the Native American populations, is there's very high density of tribes in those areas. So I think that's another, we have the Navajo Nation, which is very powerful. They have, they are their own nation. They have a lot of resources and businesses and all this kind of stuff for the tribe. But it's interesting to see those other states that have, high levels of poverty. And then, there are tribes in other areas. But I just, when I was reading the data, I thought it was interesting that the 3 other highest were, like I said, New Mexico, Arizona, and Oklahoma, because we know that there are tribes there, and there's different levels of opportunity. So I was in Oklahoma, I think 2 years ago, and I went out, I was in Norman, so, it's a college town, kind of different part of Oklahoma, but I drove from Norman out to actually a major tribe in Oklahoma. They had, a large reservation. They had a lot of services. But it wasn't shocking to me because I don't live in a little bubble. Like, I realize that people live very differently. But I remember driving from Norman out to the tribe and seeing these little trailers and these Confederate flags, and I was on tornado watch when I was there. There was a tornado watch, and so just thinking that every time there's a tornado, these people are misplaced because that little trailer is not going to hold up to a tornado. Most houses won't. Unless it's an old brick house, I think that's like the best chance of holding up. So I'll tear off the roof, but these stick homes, small homes, these trailers, they are not going to hold up to a tornado. So it was really interesting to me to watch this kind of paradigm shift where I'm driving through Confederate flags and that whole kind of, I'm just going to say, white supremacy culture. I don't agree with the idea that the Confederate flag represents a culture, because if you are in that culture, it was based on racism and all that stuff. So, and when I was growing up in Petaluma, there was trucks driving around sorry, not trying to be stereotypical, but they were always big trucks, lifted trucks, and they would fly the Confederate flag next to the American flag. And I think that there has been a better connection between what that means to people of color, especially when they're driving past that. And I think so. It was so interesting because I was with a Native American when I was there, and unfortunately, it had seemed that she had been somewhat desensitized to it, like where I was just like, oh my God, this is really uncomfortable. Where, being with someone that has to deal with that kind of racism on a daily basis, it's unfortunate. It's really unfortunate, but there's kind of this why can't I say that word? Desensitization? No, I'm not saying it right. Anyway, you know what I'm trying to say. So there's been this whole process, but, and so one of the biggest reasons that one of the biggest indicators is, so I talked about industry leaving the urban areas, but in these rural areas, which see the most poverty in the country, is that there's a really low level of educational attainment. So like I said earlier, that means having a high school diploma is what we consider educational attainment. So there's really low levels. They are ag communities. They are built on, doing agricultural related jobs instead of an emphasis on school. So, and we know the schooling system in the United States is so bad, but we'll get into that later. So there's this idea of absolute poverty, which this was calculated by the World Bank. And absolute poverty is being able to meet the minimal requirements necessary to afford basics in your life. So it's in line with the monetary poverty, but there's a lot of critics that are out there that are talking about that they don't include other sources of income in the poverty calculation. So wherever you stand on this, but they're basically saying that other sources of income like tax credits and tax advantages and social services should be counted as income, which would very much change the poverty levels considerably. But so I think that that's part of the reason, I don't want to speak on behalf of the World Bank, but I think that's part of the reason that they're doing poverty in terms of what the minimum is to live versus looking at overall income, which, and I've said over and over and over again that calculating poverty level for services in California is crazy because the standard of living is so high here. So if you're using a federal poverty level to calculate who can get services in California, you are talking about a huge difference in the numbers. And I know a lot of California services you can get up to 200% of poverty, but you're talking about, so what is that, $27,000 a year per person at best? You living in California for $27,000 a year is insane. That's just an insane way to receive services. So the World Bank, like I said, that those living on less than $1.25 per day are in extreme poverty. Could you imagine? Just take a second while we're here and imagine what it would look like to live on $1.25 a day. That's everything. That's all your expenses. That's not just food. That's all your, that's lower than the food stamp amount. It's like $4.50 a day, I think. But if you're feeding a family, I know that there's a lot of people that can't live off food stamps with the level that it is. And then those living for less than $2 a day are in moderate poverty. Moderate poverty for $2 a day. That's insane. That's totally insane. So I already talked about the critics of how poverty is calculated. So let's talk about some causes. And again, this is from an article on debt.org, but I completely align with where they are on the causes of poverty. So poverty and education. So as I mentioned, educational attainment is a huge indicator of poverty. And unfortunately in this country, so again, in the South is one of the places, so we see really high poverty levels, but in the South is one of the places we see it so prevalent, is that they're literally using textbooks that have been outdated for years, decades. And it's not just about, people bring up about the issues with not teaching proper history to our population, but further, it means that children don't have the necessary information to actually succeed in the country we live in. Because not only are they getting a very limited history of the United States, they're getting a very limited education in the United States. And I think that we have like one of the worst education systems in the entire developed world. So we have I thought that was on here before, but we have the highest level of poverty of all the developed countries in the world. So let that set in for a hot second, because we talk about being so powerful and being so rich and being so well off, but at the end of the day, we have the highest poverty rate of the developed world. So, that's something to, like I said, if nothing else, if you don't remember anything else from this radio show, remember that one little fact, because I think it'll very much indicate how you think about poverty. I'm knocking the microphone with my Italian hands. So, poverty and health. So, again, it has been seen for many years in public health that there is a correlation between poverty and health levels. So, the more impoverished you are, the more likely you are to be unhealthy. I mean, which one's the chicken and egg? Which one came first? Not really sure. I think that we've had a very long history of poor health, especially as soon as the processed food kind of thing started. Was it like the 1960s that TV dinners and stuff came out, somewhere around there? I don't know. Maybe 1950s. I think 1960s. I'm not really sure. But this whole idea of eating processed food, drinking soda as on a regular basis has really debilitated the advancement of a large amount of the population. So my background's in public health, and I believe in this very strongly, that the quality of our food affects the human body and the success of people more than what we're eating. So I don't know if that makes sense, but it is quality over quantity. You need to eat high quality food, and if you're eating off processed food, which, the argument is always that in a lot of these states that I was talking about, like Mississippi, Oklahoma, they may not have the access to fresh fruits and vegetables and all that kind of stuff because it just doesn't grow there. And so there's a lot of corn products, there's a lot of beef, there's a lot of kind of stuff that come out of those states that people end up eating. Just had an E. coli breakout for ground meat all over the country. I'm not going to talk about that because it's so gross how that happens. But, I don't eat meat, and I don't normally eat meat, and I don't eat romaine lettuce because of this reason. Because you don't want to hear about how E. coli poisoning happens in food. So, anyway, back on track. So, poverty and health, I have some statistics specifically about that, and I'll get more into the implications of that later. But, so the top earners in the country live 6.5 years longer. And I created an infographic when I worked in Marin City that actually showed that it compared Marin City and Ross, which are similar sizes, huge discrepancy in income. I can't even remember. I think it was almost double. I think it was double the income in Ross, average income. And so I made this infographic showing that people in Ross actually lived 15 years longer. 15! That's not a small number. That's like a huge age difference. And so it speaks so much to how your zip code matters, where you live matters, your environment, your built environment matters. Because literally people with more money live longer. And it's always interesting to me that these topics become well known way after the fact, in my opinion. I remember studying in economics when I was like 19, which was, I'm a 30-something, so I can expose that was 14 years ago? 14. I want to age myself. Anyway, 14 years ago, I remember my economics teacher was talking about how people that had more money lived longer. I was getting that in economics. It wasn't a public health course. It wasn't a social psychology course. It was an economics course. And, you know, I wish people had more of this information because most people aren't going to take an economics course, especially at SRJC. Super hard, just saying. But nonetheless, I think this is really important information for people to have. Like, I was getting in economics, and then 7 years later, I can't do math right now, 6 or 7 years later, we were talking about it in my public health program. And then now, finally, after all this time, probably within the last 5 years, I'd say that it's becoming more of a mainstream conversation that, yes, where you live matters more than most anything else. It matters more than your genetics. You know, it matters. It impacts everything. And I talk all the time about the social determinants of health, and all of that is based in place. Because your access to education, your built environment, your access to healthcare and mental health care, your economic stability, and your sense of community connections all is affected by where you live. I mean, and it's so intuitive and that's why it's so crazy that it took all these years to be in the mainstream. Like, it's so intuitive to be like, oh yeah, all those things affect where I am and how I live. And, you know, I live in Petaluma. It's a super affluent city now. It didn't used to be that way, but it's super affluent. Like, there's access to, it's super white. It's more diverse than it was when I was growing up, though, I have to say. But, you know, it's way affluent now. So people have access to what they need. And I feel that really vastly overshadows what is necessary to actually be successful. And then we have these hidden populations. I've talked about it before, where the census tract where I grew up, so if you live in Petaluma, the census tract is right across from the Kmart shopping. It was always the Kmart shopping center when I was growing up, even though everyone doesn't know it's there now. But where that shopping center is, if you cross the street directly from McDonald's, that is the poorest census tract in Petaluma. That's where I grew up. And so it's very different times. But then if you look, I believe it's Cherry Valley District, which is nearby here. Are we in Cherry Valley? No, we're nearby. Where I'm sitting in the studio right now on Keller Street. They are the wealthiest census tract in Petaluma. And so I don't remember the life expectancy difference. I did a video on it a really long time ago. But there is a vast difference in expectancy level. And we're talking in the same city. We're not talking, you know, one city to the other. We're talking literally in the same city, that you have impoverished people on the other side of town, and then you have the wealthy west side. And I don't want to get into a whole political conversation about this, but we have the NIMBYs, which is not in my backyard, and we have a lot of people on the west side that have a lot of money, and they say, we need affordable housing, we need this, we need that, but I don't want it to be here. As long as it's not here, then we're good. As long as it's not in my backyard, we're good. And so that's kind of a feeling, you know, NIMBY became a term because this is something that's experienced all over the place. But, yeah, like I said, I don't want to get in a whole political conversation because I have a whole lot to say about the west side of town and how we don't agree on any change, and not any of us, but don't want to see any change. Like, this is my town, but we have changed as a town, a city, whatever you want to call it, a city. We have changed as a city, and so we need to better accommodate that change in order to keep people here, let them live here, let them work here. You know, we don't want to lose the diversity in our city because, again, lower income people it's more prevalent to be people of color. It's data. I know people don't like having these hard conversations. They don't like talking about it, but those populations aren't as involved. They cannot overspeak the loud NIMBY voices. And, you know, these are just things we have to consider. So I did a whole show on the state of Petaluma a while ago. So if you want to hear my candid opinion, you can do that there. It's right after the elections, or right before the elections, the local elections. Anyway. You can find it. All my videos live on Facebook if you're watching, and I've been trying to get all of them on my website as well, or YouTube. So Anyway, back to poverty and health. So African Americans have double the infant mortality, and I have found that this is a topic that also has become more mainstream than it was before. And I do think it's social media and access to information is a double-edged sword, because it can be great for sharing information. It can also be terrible because it's sharing misinformation. But I do think that this is kind of something that's become way more of a prevalent conversation in the current, United States. So poor adults are twice as likely to get diabetes, and I wouldn't be shocked. I didn't have a youth estimate, but I think it's because, if I recall, when I was working in Marin City, for some reason, you can't say that youth have diabetes. You have to say, like, at risk is how the data is. Or there's something weird like that where we don't report. I mean, there are reports on children with diabetes, so I'm not sure. I can't remember for sure, but there's something weird about that. But I mean, I think it's the children of my generation are speculated to be the first generation to die at a younger age than our parents, because, the life expectancy has been increasing. And so the theory now is that the children of my generation will live shorter lives than their parents. Shocking. That's not shocking to you. It's shocking to me. So poor children, so this is a huge Flint thing right now, is that poor children are twice as likely to have unhealthy levels of lead in their blood. And again, there was a lead program when I was but there was a program that really addressed this when I was working in Marin County. And again, you have these really wealthy counties. Marin County is a super wealthy county. And so you have these counties that can address these issues and provide these services, but unfortunately, most of their population's at really low risk. Now, when I was working in Marin County, the media got pressed, the county got pressed super hard, because there was this idea that the actual populations that were in the greatest need were being ignored. And I was very lucky, or however you want to look at it, I was very lucky to watch that transition happen, because people were finally holding how the media depicted certain areas, how the county treated certain areas. We got a new medical director, we got a new director of health and human services. And so I think that when those transitions started to happen, we got to see how these populations were being treated or mistreated. And that the county, as a county, you're providing services to the entire county, but you also have these services that are provided to the extremely impoverished, the impoverished, 200% of the poverty level. And so if you're actually completely ignoring populations in your county, like, you're not going to have a good day, because people are going to figure it out soon. Be like, what the heck are you doing? And so that happened when I was there. So, it's been years, but I really saw a significant transition while I was working down there. So that's nice to see. But again, Sonoma County is a poor county. And so we can't, relatively, because we had the fires and the floods, and that hit the county very hard. And so the Board of Supervisors is having a very hard decision of how to, kind of mitigate that loss. And it's not an easy decision. It's never an easy decision to figure out how to manage after these catastrophic incidents that came, which cost the county a lot of money, which people don't recognize. There wasn't like 100% reimbursement level for the county. So, all that staff time, all that respond time, all that kind of stuff, it really adds up. And so our county has a very difficult situation to deal with. And it's been something that's been happening since the fires, but I think, it's an ongoing complication. So my point is that not every county in the country, like Marin County, which is super wealthy, can provide these types of services and really hone in on the poor populations within their county that need the services most. They can't really, they don't know how to hone in on that, because we don't have the money to hone in on it. So those populations kind of get, sometime, again, I think in California, we are in a bubble where we have really strong social services, where when I'm talking about these states that have the highest levels of poverty, they don't have the same level of social services. I mean, we've seen with these states that are outlawing abortion, even within the cases of incest and rape. I think that, we're seeing this debilitation of access to healthcare. And I'm going to get into this. I got to get through. Running out of time. So let me get through this background. So another one's poverty in food. Like I already talked about that. I talked about how the lack of access to fresh food and living off processed food is really debilitating people's ability to be successful in the world. And we know that a lot of kids go starving, and that impedes their ability to be successful in school, in life, all that kind of stuff. Because if you're hungry, you're not thinking about the curriculum you're learning. You're hungry. So I said this already. Highest poverty rate among the developed world, and this is from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And there's this other calculation that they do, which is called relative child poverty. And again, it has more to do with like basic needs, but we're the second highest behind Romania in the 35 richest countries in the world. That's embarrassing. Like, if you're not embarrassed by this as an American, like, this is bad. So there's also this idea that I wanted to add called the working poor. So they are above poverty, because again, especially in California, not only in California, but when we're talking about the working poor, we're saying they're not in poverty because the poverty level is so incredibly low nationally, but they are living paycheck to paycheck. They can't save money. There is high levels of debt. There was bad loans during the crash, which people are still carrying. There's high levels of student debt. And so that can kind of result in the living poor. And one of the solutions that is always offered is providing a living wage. But the problem with a living wage is that it'll create inflation. That's economics. And then one of my biggest fears is, so we have the living wage coming up or increased minimum wage. Is it $15 an hour? So my biggest fear around the increase of the wage to $15 an hour is that people are going to lose their public services that they had before, and they're not going to realize it. Because again, healthcare, all these kind of things are based on the federal poverty level. So, we're going to create the situation where people are all of a sudden going to lose their health care. They're going to lose their food stamps. They're going to lose their public housing. They're going to lose all these things. And so our public services programs nationally are so broken that it actually doesn't address this. So, I think California, there's a lot that California can do in order to address these issues. But I think it's going to be kind of a shock initially, because $15 an hour, you still can't afford medical in this country. You still can barely get by in this state for that. Barely. I don't even know if you can get by for $15 an hour in this state. So again, and a lot of that cost is going to be passed on to consumers. So it's kind of this double-edged sword. Again, like, you're trying to provide people with a higher income, but you also have to assess the downside of what that's going to look like. And, I'm concerned. I'm really concerned about how this plays out. And I'm not saying that people should make living wage. I think they should. I think that people more so, though, should have equal opportunity to success. I think that is an important element. And we'll see what happens. So, the bottom line. So, I'm finally to my closing. I got 15 minutes. I like to talk. So, once I get my groove. So, the bottom line is, I already brought this up. So we know that more impoverished states or areas have a low level of education attainment. So I already mentioned how we're talking about these populations having super old books, and, that's just one example. These beat up schools. They're unsafe, a lot of them in certain urban areas. And so there's a lack of safety. Children are going to bed at night with an empty stomach. They're coming to school without breakfast. They just don't have any of that opportunity to really be successful in their community or in their school. And so, these are all things that really need to be considered nationwide. And like I said, it's super embarrassing on on an international level what the United States is providing people. I mean, this is bad. And in California, it's really bad. Like, our education system for such a state that is an innovator internationally. We have such a huge economy internationally, and yet we can't even provide a good education to our children in this country. I mean, come on. Like, this is it. And I was watching a video, so I'm obsessed with this. It's called FEMA Prep Talks. I highly recommend it if you are into any sort of disaster preparation. Not like doomsday preppers. This is actually looking at innovative ways to address and prepare for disaster situations. And, I think like I said, it talks a lot about messaging, sharing of information, communication, how it affects kids, how to get kids prepared. Where the one I watched today was about how to get children prepared for disaster. And talking about the stigma is that, people think they're going to be scared or this and that. But really, we know that providing information to our children, they bring it home and they love sharing what they've learned. They're super impressionable, which can be used for good or bad. A lot of advertising is used for bad because their children are saying, I want this, I have to have this. So, but it can be used for good. So children can be used for good. And so, but we need to educate them. I mean, even at a basic level, and I just saw an article today that, was it the county or the state? I can't remember, but they're re-looking at charter schools because it's kind of, I have seen in communities about how it actually increases segregation and offers a lack of opportunity to certain students that are in the public school versus the charter, because you can look into charter schools, they're different, they have different donor bases, they have different things going on, they're quasi-public, but they're public, but I call them quasi-public, but something to look into if you're interested in that. But like I said, I can't remember if it was the state, but they're going to start changing the requirements of charter schools, probably to be more inclusive. I would hope to be more inclusive. That's a big deal. So, lack of access to healthcare. I already talked about that. And I've talked about in other shows about how big pharma and a lot of healthcare companies, they want to keep people sick because that's how they make money. If we were like Europe, which gives doctors incentives for having healthy patients, our whole medical healthcare system would not look the same way it was now. Because again, we want to keep people sick. That's how healthcare institutions make money. And if people are healthy, Big Pharma's not going to make money. They're not going to put out all this type 2 diabetes medication, which actually doesn't address the root causes of diabetes, which is diet and exercise. So, those are huge considerations. And then drug and alcohol abuse. So I didn't see any stats on this when I was doing it today, but drug and alcohol abuse is a huge indicator of poverty. And I think that the reason there's probably not a lot of data about it is because these people aren't in the census tract. They're not filling out, the census information. They're on the streets. They're trying to get by. So I think there's like a disconnect between that data, but we know how many homeless people there are. Again, Sonoma County, much lower than other parts, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how low it is, because if we pride ourselves on being this really strong community, then we need to start addressing the homeless population and the living poor. I think that idea of the working poor, I think that that's a really important idea to keep in mind, because it's something we don't talk about. But people that can't save, data shows us that they're not going to be successful in life. They're not going to have a retirement. They're going to rely on the state. Family, churches are the 3 top ones. And that costs a lot of money, where maybe we could start addressing some of these issues and then it's not going to cost us all that money at the end. Like, why not believe in prevention? But we know healthcare, our current administration defunded a bunch of preventative programs because, again, we want to keep people sick so that these companies make money. And then there's this whole idea of keeping populations poor. And so that's kind of something about the drug and alcohol abuse, is that, you know, there's a lot of theory that drugs were introduced to, especially the Black population, that, you know, that we're keeping people poor by keeping them intoxicated and keeping them incarcerated. So, you know, I can't remember. I did a show on incarceration. You should go back to it. But it shows, obviously, that Black men especially are the highest incarcerated. But the issue is that they get harsher sentences compared to a white man that committed the same crime. And that's just fact. If that makes you uncomfortable with me saying it, then you need to check your facts, because that's a fact. Like, you can look up the data, you can see it. And actually, the data I got from, there's like a National Prison Association or something, because we have for-profit prisons in the nation, and they actually have a contract with the federal government that they have to have a certain level of occupancy in order to keep that contract, which is very disturbing, because that is a clear and perfect indicator that we're trying to keep people incarcerated so they meet their quota. They actually have a quota of keeping people incarcerated. It's disgusting. So, but they are required to report on the demographics. And so they actually reported about the African American population, especially men, that are incarcerated. So, I had one that's crime and incarceration. It's a big deal. And then debt. I've done a show on student loan debt, claiming that it will likely be the next crash will be due to student loan debt, because they were predatory loans, in my opinion, that were sold to young adults between the ages of 18 and 25. And you're sold this idea that you're going to go to school and you're going to be so successful, and that was just not the reality for most everyone. So, again, letting someone sign away, and some of the loans don't require a credit check, so you can sign away and not even require a cosigner or a credit check, because usually, you know, when you're young, you don't have necessarily built credit. It just kind of depends. But a lot of people don't have built up credit. So I think that is a big consideration, is debt. And it's just people spending beyond their means. Now, but then there's the flip side of it, is, are they really spending beyond their means, or are they just trying to get by? You know, and I talked about it in the housing stigma video about how the huge argument is like, well, just leave. Just go somewhere else. As if it's that easy. Just leave and uproot and take your family. And I don't want that. I don't want all these families to have to leave. I mean, after the fires, it was devastating to see, you know, the number one population that I was concerned about was the renters that didn't have rental insurance, because not only did they not have anywhere to go, and there was huge price gouging after, I mean, even if it was within the state limits, it still was inaccessible to people. So, you know, and that's the population that got displaced. And so it's the same kind of idea, is that, you know, I can't afford a $1.2 million house in Petaluma or $800,000 house on the other side of town. I mean, that's crazy. That's just crazy to even consider or think about. And unfortunately, again, when you have student loan debt, I have student loan debt, and, you know, even thinking about the option of owning a house and having a mortgage when I already have this huge student loan debt bill, and it's hard to think about. And that's an issue. You know, people shouldn't have to worry about that. It's part of the American dream, right? Owning a house, having a family. Well, I think the American dream's dead. That's my opinion. But anyway, so I have on my notes solutions. Well, I have about 3 minutes to cover this issue. And I think it won't take me more than 3 minutes. Because how do you find solutions to such a complicated issue? And I think it comes back to stigma. I think that whether it's housing, whether it's healthcare access, whether it's NIMBYs that don't believe in having you in their backyard, any of those considerations, I feel like all that needs to change. And that's not an overnight solution, but I think that we need to start addressing this whole individual culture that we have in the United States, because that is what has created the inequality. I've talked about it before, and I very strongly believe this. I did research on it when I was in my undergrad education. People thought I was crazy. So I think that the fragmentation of the country and then the lack of cultural identity, which now is stated as a social determinant of health, is, cultural or community-based identity engagement. I think that has contributed to the crazy fragmentation that we have in this country, because we don't address, we're not all a nation of immigrants. We have people that were forced to be here, and we had Native Americans that are here who see some of the worst health outcomes in the entire country and poverty outcomes. So we need to start, the core of it, and what's it going to take? I don't know. We've had these huge catastrophes, really, nationally, if you look politically, and that wasn't enough. It's actually getting worse. So, but I think that whatever we can do, and I saw this great graphic, because basically the speaker was saying, you can't save the world, but you need to find your place in the chain. You need to be a link in the chain and finding what you can focus on. And, one of my huge focuses is, how do we defragment this country? How do we stop saying that this is just about me and my family and my success and all that kind of stuff? So anyway, if you want to talk more, please contact me. You can reach me via email at domayne@maberme.com. And if you'd like to be on my show, please, or if you have topics for my show, please contact me as well. So again, you are listening to KPCALP 103.3 FM. I will be back in 2 weeks from today.